Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. My guest for this episode is Pranay Lal, who has in-depth knowledge of science, policy, and practice covering domains of health, climate change, environment, and development. He is a speaker and guest faculty at leading institutions on environment and climate change, and he's the author of 2 best-selling books. Indica, A Deep Natural History of the Indian Subcontinent, published in 2016, and Invisible Empire, The Natural History of Viruses, published in 2021. When I initially contacted Pranay Lal, it was with the hope of discussing his book Indica. The book, which is a natural history of the Indian subcontinent, is both wondrous and wonderful, with its broad exploration of life and specifically how the Indian subcontinent landed where it is in geographical terms or found its coordinates and bearings. In the book, Pranay takes us on an immensely fascinating journey through deep time. In this journey, we see life evolve and change, ranging from single-cell life to mega dinosaurs to the carnival of mammals, as he terms it. But in our discussions before the interview, we kept it open that we could take on another trajectory. So we pretty much winged it on the day of our discussion. And I'm so glad we did. In a far more freewheeling discussion, we talked about Indica and natural histories, but also about his present research and book, which is about the history of climate and the climate of history. In his present work, which is ongoing, he looks at stories of history through a climate lens. What role did the weather play? How did forces of nature or rivers change the course of certain histories or dynasties? It's a sneak peek, and I, for one, cannot wait to read this book when it is out. This also afforded us the chance to hear from him on the current climate crises, how they are framed, and how solutions are also so-called framed. We've edited this episode so you hear from him on different topics, with a short introduction from me at different junctures. But before sharing that with you, I still think it is useful to highlight a few things about Indica that for me help ground this conversation. The first is the concept of deep time. In Indica, Pranay Lal uses the elegant analogy of Nigel Calder, an astrophysicist, of the Earth as a 46-year-old Earth woman, as a timekeeper. So here we have to imagine a 4,600 million-year-old Earth woman. Each year of her life is actually a mega century, 100 million years. The first 7 years we know very little, but the deeds of her later childhood are to be seen in old rocks in Greenland and South Africa. Most of what we recognize on Earth, including all substantial animal life, is the product of the past 6 years. She flowered, literally, in her middle age. Her continents were quite bare of life until she was getting to 42, and flowering did not appear till she was 45, just 1 year ago. In the middle of last week, in Africa, some man-like apes turned into ape-like men, and at the end of the weekend, she shivered off ice ages. Just over 4 hours have elapsed since a new species calling itself Homo sapiens started chasing other animals. Just 1 minute has passed out of Earth's 46 years since the Industrial Revolution. Let me repeat, 1 minute. So keep this analogy in mind when listening to this episode. The second thing I want to highlight is that as Pranay Lal writes in Indica, the surface of Earth is an extremely volatile place, constantly moving and shifting, although this is not perceptible to us except during an earthquake. If you were to compress the past 3 billion years or so of our planet's life into a minute-long video, land and water will be seen moving around as hazy blurs of blue and brown, and a few seconds of white in between when ice covered parts of the Earth. If you were to make this film 5 minutes long, it is possible that you may not even spot India until about 20 seconds before the end credits roll, This is because the oceans and lands have changed their shape several times over these 3 billion years. Pranay Lal writes that over billions of years there has been so much churning of land that many of the continents today are actually mosaics of different land masses. When our timekeeper, the Earth Woman, was 10 until she was around 44, all of the continental land masses were all lumped together. So it's only in the last 2.5 years of our Earth Woman's life that the land masses began to resemble the separate continents in the shapes that we recognize today, although some of these were still attached to each other like pieces of a jigsaw. These demarcations of countries and continents are made by history and politics rather than geology, geography, or even biology. So keeping in mind these deep time scenarios and the churning of the earth over billions of years, let's listen in to more of what Pranay Lal has to say on this and much more. In this section, Pranay Lal speaks of his book Indica, which is a deep natural history of India and how he managed to get it published. He speaks of how difficult it is to get books published on natural history and geology and our rivers and beaches.
But it took me 22 years to write this book. I mean, not to write the book, to find a publisher. So I had to go and wait and talk to marketing and different people in a publishing house. And it was so difficult to get them interested in this book. So it's just good luck that at Pradeep Krishan's home, I got talking to him about why Indians burn their forests to produce beedi, So Pradeep was doing a litigation on the way trees are cut. And I was saying that, could you bring an element of that we should stop deliberate forest fires in India's forests. Now think about it. India's forests are net producer of carbon rather than net sink. That's because we have to produce beedis. Now beedis makes us the world's TB capital, tuberculosis capital. It makes us a capital of lung cancer, and it keeps beedi rollers and tendu pluckers impoverished for the rest of their lives. This is not going to get them out of poverty, right? For the last 100 years since they've started plucking tendu leaves, nobody's crawled out of poverty because of rolling beedis or plucking tendu. In fact, the forests have been completely destroyed. What was once beautiful teak forest, a mixed teak forest, is now just tendu, right? It's a shrubby tree to produce this. So that's how we got talking. And I said, this is not how it is. And I told him a side story about the Deccan thing. And he said, wow, he just asked me if I have anything written. I said, yes, I have a whole book written. So I sent him a chapter on Deccan and he loved it. And he said that I'll introduce you to somebody. And that's how the book happened. Otherwise, perhaps that chance event of meeting Pradeep Krishan to discuss forest fires in Madhya Pradesh had not happened, Indica wouldn't have happened. Because we are not encouraging people to write seriously about issues that we talk about. I mean, there's no great book on rivers of India. There's such amazing rivers in India. We've got such wonderful beaches in India we've not talked about. That's why we don't enjoy going to beaches. All the lakes and ponds have gone in India. So we don't celebrate any of that, right? I'm very fortunate that somebody like Pradeep Krishan was able to identify spot an opportunity that he thought that there was a book in it, right? And of course, all the geologists who I used to pester, and not just geologists, everybody from earth sciences, I would just go and pick up their bags and help them dig the earth when they are kind of cleaning the first fossil and say, wow, I would just listen to them talk. That's how I picked up my whatever little geology I know, paleontology I know.
In this section, Pranay speaks about climate over deep time, the compression of climate variability over a short time, and nature's interlinked chemical cycles.
And I think climate used to be pretty stable for significant periods of time. So, we've had, snowball Earth when Earth looked like a snowball. Perhaps if we had a satellite at the time, it would have looked like completely like a slush ball of ice. And we had a hothouse, looked like a casserole. Imagine, just the entire atmosphere filled with water vapor. It's extremely hot. Some creatures survived, many of them perished. So Earth's been warmer than the present times. The challenge now at current time is that two big challenges. First, we've never seen such a drastic change in temperatures in such a short time, what is called the hockey stick graph, right? So what we've been seeing since, say, 1750 to now, or even 1970 to now, because, the major El Nino of 1973 to now, the carbon dioxide concentration, the methane levels are extremely high, and temperatures have become pretty unbearable in summers in most parts of at least in the northern hemisphere. I think we're losing a lot of ice cover. I think this year's records from Antarctica are very, very, depressing. But nevertheless, the point I'm making here is that the climate variability has kind of compressed in such a short time. Right, that's the first thing. Second thing that is important is that we have kind of compromised Earth's functions and processes like no other organism. There's only one organism that has actually transformed Earth's environment at such a scale. And those were the first photosynthetic microbes, right? You would recall that in Indica, there was this organism that I talk about. It's a colony of organisms called stromatolites. Now, they produce so much oxygen, so much free oxygen, that it caused the Earth to cool. And not just once, it cooled several times. So between 3.6 billion years to about 700 million years, Earth would constantly go into cycles of freezing and cooling, and the Earth was frigid. It was only because of massive volcanic activity or separation of some movements in the Earth's core that caused the sea to spread. And when the sea spreads, Earth splits. I mean, continents and land masses tend to go their own way. And that creates new opportunities for ocean currents to, become wider, stronger. And the circulation of temperature, new types of circulatory patterns distribute temperature around the Earth's surface. Now, that process is something that in this short period of 250 years or 350 years since the industrial age, is something that organisms cannot evolve to, right? I mean, we've added so many chemicals, we've added new gases. We make 22,000 new chemicals. We add 22,000 new synthetic chemicals each year since 1960, right? And these have no ecological fate, right? They're left in dumps or even in rivers or wherever. It goes through our wash basins, right? I mean, think about it, our toothpaste or shampoos or whatever, right? These are things that never existed in nature. They're all synthetic chemistry, right? And there's no ecological fate because there's no organism in the river, the pond, the soil to digest it. So what happens to it, right? And the impact of this. So the two challenges for us is we've never seen a sharp increase in temperature of this nature. And we have not seen our ecosystems getting devastated the way that we have done that. So when the stromatolites started to act on, to change the atmosphere the way they did, what they did was they also enabled to create more minerals. Those minerals were able to help more, a new type of mineral is also called species. That's the very interesting thing that geologists say. So that also spurred evolution in several directions, right? Whether it's several other types of microbes, but also, around 750 million years ago, there was this massive volcanic event that happened near Jodhpur, right? And that's the one that added new minerals, of course, but also liberated the Earth from a very significant ice age. I mean, for about 200 million years, the Earth had been under the cover of ice and snow. Now, when that happened, and there was a big outpouring, and if you go to Jodhpur, I mean, you would see that the fort of Jodhpur, called Mehrangarh, actually stands on a volcanic neck, right? It's a beautiful neck of volcanic rock called rhyolite. Now, those minerals and that moment enabled Earth, at the time, the surface of the Earth, to start a process of multicellularity. Before that, there was no multicellular creature. Everything was single celled. I mean, there might be creatures eating a single celled creature eating another single. There was all other types of sophisticated ecological systems, or trophic levels as they're called. But there was no multicellular creature. Now, this is the moment in life that you start seeing multicellular creatures arrive in a big way, right? And so you find these wonderful fossils in Jodhpur, in sandstones of Jodhpur, of earliest algae and amazing ediacaran fossils there. They look like plates and jellyfishes and, absolutely gorgeous. We don't even have a natural history museum in India where we can actually talk about this, right? I mean, there's none in this country. So when you talk about climate change, we must remember that nature invariably has interlinked chemical cycles, right? So when people talk about climate change and say, oh, we should be looking at only carbon and carbon dioxide and methane, if methane ever comes in the argument, in the discussion. The challenge is that carbon by itself cannot be consumed because it's linked with iron. It's very intricately linked with silicates. And I think in Indica, if you read Indica carefully, I actually talk about this. But I'll come to that a little later. But all these minerals, all these elements are intricately related. You can't talk about carbon capture or carbon burial without talking about iron, silicates, phosphorus, phosphates, because all those cycles are broken. It's not just carbon. So we've jeopardized that. And our ecosystems, they might look healthy. Many of them are. But the fact is, ecosystems are also correlated and they're linked. So if this ecosystem sits on top of a rock, which is, say, rich in phosphorus, the next one is rich in iron. And there is a movement of these minerals in cycles. And there's a cascade, and there's a certain way in which this happens. And we've kind of mined a mineral, like I said about minerals, also called species in geological terms. There are rocks that have gone extinct because we've overmined a certain area. When you overmine, that means you've taken away a certain mineral that was supposed to play a certain role. Slow release of a mineral into the next boundary crosses. So, those kind of things are missing.
Here, Pranay Lal speaks of monsoons, the movement of minerals in rivers, and carbon burial.
Well, I think a lot of people say this, that, monsoons are India's finance minister, right? So your budget is entirely dependent, and next year's budget is entirely dependent on how the monsoons have been this year, right? I think that's very true. There are very few countries as dependent, as those in South and Southeast Asia, so dependent on monsoons. So the story of the monsoons is very interesting, and I think there are some amazing books, and there's friends like in ITM, like Roxy Call and Professor Madhavan at Atria University. They're such eloquent speakers about the history of monsoons, and of course there are some great books on monsoons. But I think there's not been an understanding of how monsoons actually work as a climate pump, right? Monsoons are both the cause and the manifestation of a good year in which we can, a previous monsoon can stabilize the next year if we allow it to bury the carbon that it's supposed to bury naturally. Now, let me explain this to you. Now, when rain falls, it is not pure water. As it descends, it mixes with carbon dioxide and it becomes mildly acidic. It's carbonic acid, a little like your Pepsi and Coca-Cola, but that's heavily concentrated carbonated drink. This is mildly acidic, but it's acidic enough to etch out a young silicate rock that exists in the Himalayas. Himalayas are the youngest silicate rock mountains in the world, right? And they face the full force of the monsoons. Now, when this happens, etches out a lot of silicate. The carbonic acid in the rainwater binds with the silicate and then it goes down the Ganga. Now, this is the place when, your dada and dadi or nana and nani would tell you that Ganga ka pani kabhi kharab nahi hota hai. The Ganga water doesn't get spoiled, right? You take any other water, it would start to rot after a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. You can take Ganga's water and it doesn't get spoiled. The answer to that, the reason for that is because it's very high in silicates. So Ganga carries silicate bound with carbon dioxide naturally into the Bay of Bengal. Now, Bay of Bengal is unique. Although the Bengalis and the Bangladeshis love fish, they don't eat marine fish. They don't eat sea fish. Most of them eat freshwater fish, right? That's because the Bay of Bengal is not such a fertile place for fish to breed. There's a unique thing about this. Now, it's all related to the monsoons, the way the carbon and the silicate interact and come into the Bay of Bengal, right? The biggest carbon burial process naturally that happens year on year is by the Ganga, the Indus, the Brahmaputra. and their tributaries. Now, what we've done is we've jeopardized this. We've created, n number of dams. We've created barrages. We've stopped the sediment to flow from the rivers into the sea. So we don't have carbon capture. And as a result, you've got acidified rivers which do not capture carbon, and they end up ruining not just the river, but also the whole carbon balance that was supposed to happen. And here, that's why I'm saying it's carbon and silicate. Other rivers have carbon and iron. Some of them, others have other relationships. So that's why I keep saying that a river is only a conduit. It's moving elements, but it's what's all as it's doing that, it's not just churning elements in and around oceans, but it's also making sure that there is some cycle which kind of impinges upon the carbon cycle, which is important to us just now. But we can't talk about it in isolation because carbon is intricately related or linked with other minerals and other elements.
In this next section, he speaks on the lack of protection of our fossil and geological heritage in India and the importance of looking at landscapes and ecosystems from a deep time perspective.
The challenge is this, that the word fossil doesn't appear in Indian legislation anywhere. If you were to look for the word fossil, so you could actually trade in fossils and nobody will stop you, right? Now, the rest of the world, including Mali, have the word very clearly in their legislation. Sri Lanka has it, Egypt very clearly has it. So I can name you countries that have very good legislations that protect their fossil heritage or their geological heritage. India has none, right? So that's the first point. So I think the reason why I like to look at landscapes and ecosystems from a deep time perspective is because only then do you have some appreciation of how things got there. If you talk about a disease, right? I mean, any disease, how did it cross over into human beings? And why did it cross over at that time? What was the creature that was harboring that pathogen in his or in its lung or gut or wherever before it crossed over to us, right? Now, that's a fascinating part of the story, right? And I think it's the same with locations, with landscapes. How can you start building dams or, digging for groundwater if you don't know the rock systems or the nature of water, the flow of water, or the seasonality of it? But we just go hammer and tongs because we've got the technology, right? And that's what has happened year on year. The problems with fluorosis and hard water and arsenic in water are all creations of stupidity because we just did not look or consult with, say, hydrogeologists, geologists, sedimentologists, groundwater experts, local communities. I mean, they know so much about it. I mean, they know when the water in the soil is going to rise up, and they know because they have wells, and wells tell them when the water goes up and down, and that's simple, right? You don't have to have high level studies or satellite imaging or whatever. I'm talking of 60s, 70s. You didn't have to do that. All you needed to do was consult with communities who knew the grassroots science as well as science of the various kinds that I mentioned, several other disciplines and sub-disciplines. The problem globally, and I think it's not so much just India's problem. I think it's because we have this arrogance of saying that we know this is what has to be achieved and this is what we'll do, right? Whether you want to decimate an island or whether you want to interlink a river is just an engineering marvel that you want to create. But what you end up doing is messing up everything, right? You create three other problems. And I think that's the arrogance that I want people to stop making now. I think we've learned enough from big dams and making roads in hills and all of that. I think it's time to step back, take that extra moment, talk to people who may know, and let's be humble enough to say, we don't know about this. Is this a risk too big that we are taking? What would happen if this would happen, right? What happened in Wayanad is extremely sad. Or, several places. What's happening in Pune just now as the floods happen there, right? The emergence of Chandipura should not have happened, or buffalo pox should not happen. Casanur forest disease that happens in North Karnataka should not happen. These are things that are now science should be able to address these issues. So there are two things. I mean, one is the prevention, and the other is the political use of, or the misuse of bad science, which is called arrogance in some sense, right? So, yeah, I don't have an answer for this, but it just riles me up. You could actually trade in fossils and nobody could care.
Here I had a question for him on museums in India. I had visited the Indian Museum in Kolkata and we got talking about that. This led to a broader discussion on the lack of good museums on natural history.
The Indian Museum is basically an annex of the Geological Survey of India's. So right behind it, there's a park, a small park, and the red building that you see behind it is the Geological Survey of India. So the minerals that the British collected, starting with Raniganj and places around that, Panchet and beautiful places, they found fossils and they deposited them there, right? So I think we've not done enough. I mean, Calcutta has another fascinating. It's not open to public museum. It's in the Indian Statistical Institute, which also had some great paleontologists. And there are only two assembled dinosaurs in India. The second one is in Hyderabad. The first one is in the ISI in Calcutta. But if you were to go to ISI Calcutta, it's not open to public. I mean, you just have to, first of all, it's located very far, but most of these inventories, these repositories, all of these are not accessible, right? You can't take photographs. You go to the Birla Museum in Hyderabad and you want to take a picture with the assembled dinosaur, the Kotasaurus, and they don't let you, right? So, and therefore it doesn't feature in my book. So all the images that you have in Indica are borrowed from other people, and other museums who just say that, listen, we've got the same Kotasaurus, here's an image. So I got images from South Africa and Sri Lanka and places like those, but I just didn't get anything from Geological Survey of India or the Government of India. The paleontologists who were very happy to give me their pictures, but that's it. So we don't like to share, we don't like to inquire, and we don't want our children to be curious. That's the single largest tragedy of our country. There are a couple good mineral museums. I think most of the universities, the geology departments have their own geology museums. But there is none that I would recommend that, see, a good museum is not just about having a great collection. It's about somebody who tells you the story. The thing is that I've been telling several of these institutes in Bangalore and several cities that you just need to have 5 items, 3 rocks, 1 fossil, and 1 another thing, maybe a diorama or whatever. And just say that this is the story of Bangalore. This is the rock, and these are the types of rocks that exist in these sequences, right? And this is how we came to exist. This is where we stand. And you can do this in your waiting room, right? I mean, you can do it in your reception while people are waiting and, I mean, why don't we have this, right? We have no pride about where we stand on our land, right? We don't know anything about how old is the Kaveri, the Tungabhadra, or the rock in Cubbon Park, or whatever. We don't want to know, right? And then if we don't know how precious the soil is or the rock is, we are not going to protect it. So we're going to have, blatant boorish projects like the ones on the Narmada or the Ganga or wherever. So, you have all those kind of things. So I think the essence of museums is critical. I think we've got some great historical museum because we love history, But I can't say the same for natural history at all. Considering that, India is such a compact country and we've got just about everything. That's what I talk about in Indica. I mean, who imagined that we had some of the most resplendent dinosaurs in the world? Again, think about it. I couldn't find a single paleo artist. The biggest challenge is that I have to procure my paintings from China and Brazil and Argentina. They've got far many and far better paleo artists than we can ever have. I mean, I don't know. I've waited and tried getting people to contribute paintings or drawings or sketches. Nothing.
We'll be back after a break. In his book Indica, some of my favorite sections are those which cover the movement of Greater India to where it is now geographically. We were once part of the supercontinent Gondwana, and we were joined at the hip by Australia, South America, and Antarctica. I like the term what came after as a great breakup, and this understanding hinges on evidence left behind by three volcanic events. The first of the eruptions paired off Africa and South America about 180 million years ago. The second eruption, around 118 million years ago, prized Australia and Antarctica away from Greater India, which comprised Sri Lanka and Madagascar. Around 88 million years ago, a third major volcanic event sundered India from Madagascar. Pieces or vestiges of this lava flow of a jigsaw puzzle can be found all over, from coal deposits to shells of sea creatures, the formation of coastlines, dinosaur fossils, volcanic rocks, and the Indian purple frog. Just one part of the puzzle is that between 180 and 118 million years ago, when India separated from Antarctica, it left behind this islet, a desolate witness to the merging and breaking of Gondwanan landmasses. Geologists call the Vivekananda Rock Memorial the Gondwana Junction because it marks a place where India, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, East Antarctica, and Australia were once joined together. Another example, the extreme eastern corner of Greater India, roughly where Shillong and Guwahati are today, was a mere stone's throw away from where Perth is now, in Western Australia. Throughout this time, dinosaurs reigned supreme across all continents and could have easily walked from Chennai to East Antarctica. The modern geological era in India began with Greater India docking with Eurasia and the subsequent rise of the Himalayas. This affected global climate and transformed the landscape across Southeast Asia, a change that favored mammals, and they emerged as inheritors of the world. A carnival of mammals arrived from Eurasia into India, and India became a highway for some and a haven for many. Pranay Lal speaks of this tectonic movement and continental shifts and how some of these movements might look in the future.
That's right. It's a giant ballroom, and so Greenland was where India was, and India was where Greenland was 750 million years ago. And India was under ice, and Greenland was actually green, right? It was a tropical paradise. It's only in a party, if you've got a couple dancing or even a single person dancing, a loser like me would never find a girl to dance in my party, in my school party. Would become like New Zealand, first person to go and isolate themselves, sit in the corner, and then it's Australia once Gondwana starts to break up. And it's India who's still moving and shaking till the end, So India is the one that thrusts and, bangs into Eurasia, raises the Tibetan plateau, creates the Pamir Knot, gets all the majestic Himalayas, the Shivaliks, the Karakoram, the Kunlun, the Tien Shan, and beyond. We still see the tremors in Nepal and Sikkim and Assam. That region is still pretty prone to earthquakes. And of course, since Susan, you've read the book, it's not India moving, it's because the sea is spreading in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean basin is widening because that's the place where the Earth's crust is weakest, and that's where the volcanic activity is highest. And so you've got new land created at the deepest points of the Indian Ocean and every ocean, Pacific, every ocean. So that's how the Earth separates and moves and continues to move, right? And so the land is getting created there. That's what is nudging the plates forward. I think there's already a lot of very interesting work happening that how would the Earth look 100 million years from now, and 200 million and 300 million. So you've seen that, of course, Africa is going to merge with Italy and Greece, and, they're going to crunch into one another. The Mediterranean is going to just shrink into a thin lake. It's already pretty salty. It's going to get saltier still. India is going to twist a little more because the activity in the Andaman Sea perhaps is going to increase, right? So India is going to kind of tilt a little towards facing Madagascar. It's not going to be the alignment that it is in now. What else is going to happen? There are going to be other land masses that are going to move. Perhaps Australia will move northwards and again crunch into Indonesia. I don't know. There are 3 or 4 very interesting models. There's one by scientist named Buckley. There's one by Christopher Scotties, who I love. I mean, all the images in Indica, thanks to Christopher Scotties, who's at University of Texas. He does amazing. Much of it, this is predictive, that you kind of imagine which underwater volcanic activity is going to be the highest in the future. And that's what is kind of, the assumptions and models and, where the thrust is going to be, how is the speed going to be. So those are the kind of things that they work with.
Here, Pranay speaks about climate science and good practices and understanding important linkages.
We've ignored the good practices of climate science because what we should have learned from nature or from geologists and earth scientists, what we've ended up doing is working on, pardon my French, bullshit strategies. I mean, there's a very good book called Bullshit Jobs. I don't know if you've read that. It's fascinating. It talks about that how much of carbon and energy is wasted because of jobs and processes and industrial processes, because of bullshit jobs, right? The same thing is happening with the climate scene today. We are not investing in the right places. We've got, like I said, each landscape in the world has a role to play in carbon capture and carbon burial. The operative word is burial. We must remember that all the fossil fuel, whether it's coal, lignite, oil, gas, anything, comes from deep earth. It was made in deep time. We take it out in a day or a week, we burn it, and it goes into the atmosphere. What took millions of years to make is released in a jiffy. What we need to do is, if we capture the carbon, we need to put it back deep into the earth and forget it. We need to find ways in which we need to lock it. What we do is we use politically acceptable, economically satisfying strategies like tree planting, and everybody's happy, right? So last week in Jaisalmer, they planted 3 million trees in a day, right? Ridiculous. They're not going to survive. And by the way, deserts, one of the best places where carbon capture happens. There's no reason why you should plant trees. Why do I say this? It's because the desert dust moves from the place of their origin, cross oceans and rivers, and goes to a place where it goes and fertilizes forests. So the Western Sahara desert moves thousands of kilometers west, fertilizes the Caribbean Sea, which has one of the best corals, and the Amazon. If you don't have the Sahara dust coming to the Amazon will collapse. The same thing with the Western Ghats. The Western Ghats get their dust from East Africa and the Arabian Desert. So all the deserts, there's a dust cycle which is providing the phosphorus, which is essential for these forests. How else do these tropical forests, shoot up? We don't understand the interlinkages, right? Solar geoengineering, iron dust distribution in oceans to neutralize carbon dioxide. These are not desirable strategies. But if we are not doing something that is going to be effective between now and a point of no return, then we'll have to adopt these very drastic, very problematic solutions, because currently they're not solutions, they're seen as a problem. What's going to happen then? So, I think Europe's done very well. Last year, I don't know whether you know this, Europe broke down 500 dams, and they said they decommissioned 500 dams and they opened the rivers, right? So things like Dnieper, Rhine, Rhone, Seine, all the dams on these rivers were broken open. Why? Because they realized that they don't produce enough electricity. They were not supporting any flood control. In fact, Europe was under floods for the last 2 decades. And more importantly, they realized that sediment transport, which is so important for carbon burial, was not happening. Now, this is where I come back again. Brahmaputra, Meghna, Ganga, Indus are so important for carbon burial that I can't even tell you how much important it is. It's 20% of the world's natural carbon cycle depends on these rivers, and we are not even accommodating them, right? So, I could actually talk to you about how complicit the climate community is, including the IPCC, because it doesn't even mention it. That, the role of rivers and lakes and ponds and the silicate cycle. It's only very recently that they've started understanding there is a role that we should get them on, focusing more on that.
In this section, we speak about the book he's writing presently on the history of climate and the climate of history. I asked him for some specific examples from the book, and we wound up the conversation.
It's going to be a bit of a spoiler because a lot of people are going to throw darts at me. I think Why Did Babur Come to India is a very interesting story. And there was a climate crisis in Afghanistan and Fargana and Samarkand and Tashkent, that whole belt where and Kabul was his last resort before he decided to come to India. In fact, a quarter of his army decided to go back to Kabul because they didn't like India. So that's a fascinating story. What made them come to India and what made him decide to stay in India was an important part. I think the whole climate story about the creation of Bangladesh, I think that's a climate story which we have not even talked about. I mean, it starts with the massive cyclone, and the cyclone was triggered because of 2 years of back-to-back El Nino that occurred. Bihar at that time had just recovered from a famine-like situation. Indira Gandhi was in trouble. She was just taken over as prime minister. She had wars on multiple fronts. I mean, the western sector, the Pakistan belligerence had begun. Bangladesh was burning. There was a famine-like situation in Bihar. Maharashtra also had a food crisis. You can't imagine what was going on between 1969 and 1973. And that crisis is a story which is entirely about El Nino. Think about it, the worst famines to begin in Africa were around 1969 and 73. You have the end of most stable dictatorships, or stable dictatorships, if there's a term like that, in terms of Haile Selassie and so many others who just collapsed. The first major leaders after the departure of the colonialists from Africa collapse in that period. The same thing happens in Peru, in Chile. So that period, 67 to 73, just about every country has had a major churn in terms of their leadership, or there's a constitutional crisis that is emerging, especially around the tropics. I find that fascinating, and nobody wants to talk about it. How crops collapsed, how livestock died, how famines were threatening so many of these countries. And I think that's a climatic story that needs to be told from a fresh perspective. What we know is that Europe and China and America, I mean, we've got some great, what is called paleoclimatic record. I think there's some good records from India as well. The only thing is we haven't put it together. So what I'm doing is I'm speaking to people and saying, hey, give me, like I did with Indica, speaking to different experts and saying, can you tell me how was Madurai 1470s, before the first invasion by the Vijayanagar kingdom, and the decline, and all those kind of things. What was Assam like before the arrival of the Ahoms from Thailand? How did they make that their home, right? So those are the kind of things. I mean, we've not heard the story of why Ahoms were the most durable empire of the Indian subcontinent. I mean, nobody's taught us that, right? But they were a great kingdom, right? So that's what I'm trying to find out. And I'm trying to understand how epidemics and famines and droughts and floods and these kind of things just disrupt life now, right? I mean, I don't know, there's some part of India today must have been badly affected by some event, right? At a much grander scale, when it was glacial melt that the water descended down from the rivers and inundated a city, or Akbar makes this beautiful fort and decides that the Yamuna has just avulsed and it's just moved further away, and he has to abandon it. It's the same thing with several forts and several cities that had to be abandoned because of the rivers getting mercurial, or the visitation of plagues and what was called vabas. I mean, vabas is basically, in Arabic, is cholera, but could be any other epidemic, right? So I'm trying to piece together all this information, not entirely from historical sources, but also from geologic, geographic, climatic sources and resources. So yeah, it's fun. It's difficult to put it all together, and like Indica, it's not going to please a lot of people because you're treading onto a new discipline, which is actually trying to look at that discipline from a fresh perspective. There's a new way of seeing things. So, and initially it tends to rock the boat a bit. The next time they talk about history, they should remember that, was it a bad El Nino year, and was there a drought in some part of India, or was there a flood, and would that have had an impact on the people? I mean, we don't talk about farmers, right? Or we don't talk about tribal communities or nomads. They were so integral to the survival of all the grand civilizations and cities that we talk about. I mean, for example, the trade of salt was entirely done by the Banjaras and a few other nomadic tribes. Something as important as salt, we don't even talk about it, right? But salt comes to our collective conscience only when we talk about Gandhi's Dandi March, right? And so those are the kind of things that we've not even considered when we talk about the subaltern of Indian history. And I'm just asking that, why did the Thai Ahoms want to not go eastwards towards the collapsing Khmer Republic? Why do they choose to come to Assam? First stay in North Burma and realize that Burma is not for them. And they come and wage a war in, east part of Assam, that what we call Assam today, and eventually settle there, marry with the coaches and the other tribal and other communities, and eventually dominate. Homes create the Assam kingdom, right? That's what is fascinating. Why did they move west? And it's a question that, the same question I ask, why is it that Vijayanagar survived for 257 years and then collapsed, and the Bahamis succeeded for longer periods? And, so those are the kind of questions I have, and I try looking at environment, ecology, behavior of rivers. And so all those factors that come together, I just say that perhaps this happened. We are not told about this in history or any other form of knowledge transfer that we get, whether formal or informal. And therefore we've got these spaces in modern contemporary political narrative of historicizing myths or mythicizing. It's not the right word, but mythicizing history. It can go both ways, right? We know that so many things are off, right? There was no Jodha for Akbar, right? But I'm not correcting that. I'm just talking about 5 big events. And I'm looking at very important 5 pulses in climate history, which might have had a bearing in India's, the trajectories of different histories and micro-histories that have happened. So that's what I'm saying. Why did the British succeed in getting a foothold into India? I think there's a climate story here. I believe that there's a possibility that the British did better compared to the other European colonists. They lost America, they lost different parts of other colonies, but they gained a very, very big foothold in India. So that's a very interesting story to talk about. And I don't think we are taught about the British history and British history of the empire. And also their departure was environmental. But it's going to be a visual feast, I can assure you that. You're going to see things that you have not seen. There are going to be pictures, images, things that I'll pull out from small museums from all across India and abroad, and the things that you would not imagine. That you're not going to see the usual stuff, let's say that.
Thanks to Pranay Lal for sharing his thoughts with us. A special thanks to Radhika Vishwanathan and Samyukta Varma from Waka, who also contributed to the lively discussion. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.